Thank you so much.
If you right click on her. Oh, yes. What is it here then?
Are we good to go?
I'm not sure why all of these are showing if you're spotlit.
You are the biggest though. You are the
Oh,
biggest.
I know. If you close participants. Yeah.
Sorry, that was a clumsy start. Sorry, we're still practicing being a hybrid conference. Yes, Caighlan Smith, we are ready for you now.
Great, thank you, no worries. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. Before I get into my talk, I'd like to give a quick trigger warning. I'm going to be discussing Carter's novel Heroes and Villains, which does involve instances of rape and physical and mental abuse, which I will be discussing. So I completely understand if you're online and you feel the need to mute the presentation at any time, or if you need to tune out, completely understand. Okay, so I'll now begin my presentation with a short exchange of dialogue from the novel. The soldiers are heroes, but the barbarians are villains, said the son of the professor of mathematics aggressively. I'm a hero, I'll shoot you. Oh no, you won't, said Marianne and grimaced frightfully. I'm not playing. This exchange happens when our protagonist, Marianne, is just a little girl when she's refusing a game of play pretend with her peers. This refusal foreshadows Marianne's role in the story, and indeed the very role the story takes in addressing the hero and villain stereotypes. That is, Carter isn't going to play at heroes and villains. Instead, she uses the post-apocalyptic dystopian genre, in which the archetype of heroes and villains are extremely prominent, to trouble our literary and indeed societal tendency to fall back on such easy, dichotomous archetypes as moral signposts. According to Tom Moylan, the dystopian genre is critically concerned with the impact of an unseen and unexamined social system on the everyday lives of everyday people. Yet, as Moylan goes on to explore, such dystopian storylines often feature an alienated protagonist who uncovers the truth behind the power systems in their society and subsequently attempts to resist such control. These storylines can either end in the dissenter being defeated and/or resubsumed, or they can end with a victorious overhaul of the protagonist's dystopian society. While dystopians ostensibly seek to interrogate the machinations of everyday life, their plot mechanics and, in extension, their characters often end up undergoing dramatic societal revelations and meeting some form of larger-than-life fate, a fate far beyond the everyday life of the everyday person. Carter, however, offers characters who, in many respects, may attempt to operate as such larger-than-life dystopian heroes and villains, but who are instead just everyday humans, both good and bad simultaneously in their everyday existence. When one reflects on the post-apocalyptic dystopian canon, from novels such as 1984, The Hunger Games, The Handmaid's Tale, to comics like The Walking Dead or V for Vendetta, or film and television like Snowpiercer or Westworld, most of these stories re-implement favorite tropes of myth and legend. For example, the hero and the good guy, or the villain and the bad guy, which function on a moral binary. In other words, while many post-apocalyptic dystopian narratives claim to investigate the moral gray of humanity, its capacity for atrocity, oppression, ignorance, dystopian titles often ultimately boil down to tales of heroes and their villains. While villains of such narratives may be allotted character depth or even character development towards a redemption arc, they are still framed narratively to the reader predominantly as villain to the protagonist's hero. Likewise, the heroes may be flawed, but still they save the day, be it in the form of saving their family, their survivor group, their district, their nation, or the world itself. The dystopian genre largely unveils, across narrative mediums, the gray-tinged battle between good and bad. I argue that in Heroes and Villains, a dystopian set years after a nuclear apocalypse, Carter rejects the standard route of heroic protagonist saves the post-apocalyptic day, and instead toys with the ideas of good and bad, hero and villain. In this presentation, I specifically seek to analyze Carter's characters, her non-heroes and non-villains. As Aaron Rosenfeld asserts, the dystopian genre has a habit of featuring cardboard characters, which act as billboards for their authors' views on society's current and future ideological operations. Carter, however, presents characters which go beyond author and/or reader insert. In fleshing out her characters through realistic engagement with human emotions, internal conflict, and moral struggles, Carter's particular breed of dystopian ideological engagement is conducted at a human rather than societal level, but to the point of revealing and exploring such individual machinations of the human mind and heart, which do indeed lead to greater societal conflicts, which inform societal construction altogether. To expose these operations, I'll conduct a close reading of Carter's three main characters in Heroes and Villains, which are Marianne, Jewel, and Donnelly, in dialogue with their interpersonal relationships. It's necessary, of course, to start with the novel's protagonist, who in many other post-apocalyptic dystopians would be the hero or anti-hero by default. However, Marianne is introduced from the get-go in such a way that challenges the reader's empathy and the reader's very desire to relate to the protagonist. Carter opens her novel by describing her protagonist as follows. Marianne had sharp, cold eyes, and she was spiteful, but her father loved her. Such an introduction not only frames Marianne as standoffish, but insinuates that her personality, even as a child, is abrasive to the degree that her father still loves her in spite of her character. Carter's development of Marianne continues to be in service to alienating her from the reader, rather than building a connection through which the reader will easily relate to or side with Marianne. For instance, Carter later describes Marianne's reaction to witnessing a raid on her community, in which she bemusedly watches the slaughter and largely finds the events of the raid interesting. At this time, to clarify for those who have not read Heroes and Villains or to refresh for those who have, Marianne lives in what is one of several protected communities led by people known as professors, who use technology and societal structures passed down from the pre-apocalyptic world. Within these communities are soldiers who protect the professors. Beyond the communities are two groups of people in conflict with the professors, the barbarians and the out people. The latter are a group who have been genetically mutated by the apocalyptic environment and now resemble animals as much as they do people. The barbarians, however, are Carter's focus, as this group is no different from the professors, aside from their traditions, their access to technology, and their nomadic way of life. Carter makes it quite clear throughout the novel that while the professors and soldiers view the barbarians as villains and themselves as heroes, it is the other way around for the barbarians. Unlike in many other post-apocalyptic narratives, which seek to show both sides in a two-sided conflict, however, there is one, no resolution between the two sides, and two, no point at which one side is proven to be truly good, while the other is truly bad. Instead, both sides have justifications for their perpetuation of the conflict, and while neither side greatly benefits from being in conflict, both sides are equally unwilling to end it. This mirrors such conflicts in reality, in situations in which deeply seated discrimination against a people or a person are not easily rectified by a heroic ending. Which brings us back to Marianne, our not quite heroic protagonist. After the death of her father, Marianne has nothing to keep her occupied, and following another raid on her community by the barbarians, finds herself helping a stowaway barbarian, Jewel, escape the soldiers. The situation escalates, however, and results in Marianne outside the community, becoming Jewel's captive. Both Marianne's desire to leave her isolated community and the subsequent fallout of her decision lead to one of Carter's radical subversions of a common post-apocalyptic dystopian trope. As Yutaka Okuhata explores, Carter's work, like many others before it, engages with the post-apocalyptic genre in its capacity to act out the fantasy of starting over. Post-apocalyptic narratives routinely depict a crumbled society in which the protagonists or heroes are free to rebuild however they like, which engages with current consumer demands for a chance to start over or hit reset. Carter uses her post-apocalyptic setting and the characters within it to trouble this desire to start over. Marianne, in seeking to leave her community and achieve her own fresh start, instead ends up in a hostile environment, which serves to exasperate, rather than free her from, the emotional and psychological issues she has carried over from her previous society. For instance, Jewel brings Marianne back to his tribe, where Marianne is not celebrated or accepted, but instead hated and feared as a daughter of the professors. Jewel's brothers even attempt to rape and murder Marianne. Rather than intervening, Jewel watches and laughs with pure pleasure. It is instead the arrival of Donnelly, an exiled professor who now acts as the barbarian's doctor and shaman, that saves Marianne, as his presence and words of warning dissuade Jewel's brothers. Here, again, Carter subverts narrative tropes in that Jewel, Marianne's love interest and a potentially heroic figure, would happily allow Marianne this fate, while it's Donnelly, who frequently skirts the line of villain throughout the novel, who initially saves Marianne. It's implied, however, that Donnelly saves and aids Marianne when needed so as to use her in his scheme to maintain control over the barbarians. As a professor's daughter, Marianne is feared but in some ways respected by the tribe. Donnelly later weds her to Jewel to cement Jewel's power in the tribe, showing that Jewel has conquered the terrifying and mysterious professor's daughter. Jewel, already in a leadership position by virtue of his family ties, is a useful pawn to Donnelly, who manipulates the barbarians through his knowledge of history, religion, and philosophy. Donnelly has cast himself as a prophet to the tribe and seeks to craft Jewel into the archetypical messiah. Despite Donnelly's manipulative plot involving Jewel and the barbarians, he does not cleanly fit the role of villain, nor Jewel the role of victim, hero, or indeed messiah. Jewel is aware of Donnelly's scheming, and later, at the end of the novel, uses his arranged marriage to Marianne and the additional power it imbues him with to his advantage to excise Donnelly from the tribe. This comes on the heels of various attempts from Donnelly, Marianne, and Jewel to kill each other or cripple each other's power in the tribe. Jewel ultimately seems to side with Marianne against Donnelly, or at least deems this most beneficial to himself. However, despite their at times homicidal rivalry, both Jewel and Donnelly admire and indeed love each other. Donnelly, as Jewel's mentor following Jewel's parents' deaths, taught Jewel about the world beyond his immediate tribe and formed a paternalistic bond with the young leader. Their individual ambitions, however, lead them to breaking this bond, but not entirely. Carter could have ended the novel with Jewel casting Donnelly out of the tribe and devoting his life to the leadership of his people with Marianne by his side. This would have been a more archetypical ending. The heroes vanquish the interloper. Instead, Carter offers us a follow-up event. After he is cast out, Donnelly is captured by the soldiers, who plan to execute him as an example to those who would abandon the communities of the professors. Jewel gets word of this, and his bond with Donnelly, despite everything they've done to each other, proves strong enough for Jewel to plan a rescue mission, which ultimately fails and leads to Jewel's death and, it is implied, Donnelly's execution. Marianne then is left alone with the tribe, pregnant with Jewel's child, resentful of Jewel for having left to save a man that used both of them, while also distraught over Jewel's death, while also resolved to take over the tribe in his stead. This ending for Marianne, a mixture of hate, love, and ambition, but no emotional resolution, let alone catharsis, alongside the tragic ends of Jewel and Donnelly, highlight Carter's radical subversion of heroic tropes. Jewel's last act of heroism is in abandoning his tribe and pregnant wife to risk his and his brother's lives saving the man who tried to kill him. Meanwhile, the last act of our protagonist and would-be hero, Marianne, is to resolve to take over the tribe, not out of a heroic and virtuous desire to shepherd them to prosperity in Jewel's absence, but out of her desire for power and her sense of self-preservation. For instance, following Jewel's death, after Marianne is told that the tribe plans to leave her behind, she says, "Oh no, they won't get rid of me as easily as that. I shall stay here and frighten them so much they'll do every single thing I say. I'll be the Tiger Lady and rule them with a rod of iron." Indeed, Carter highlights throughout the novel that Marianne, like Donnelly and Jewel, is ambitious and willing to hurt others and sacrifice to better her situation. Donnelly was willing to manipulate an entire people, was willing to kill his pseudo-son, Jewel, and frequently abused his biological son. Jewel, meanwhile, despite showing the capacity for genuine love and kindness, as seen in his behavior towards his brothers and the rest of his tribe, was also willing to watch his brothers rape and kill Marianne. Indeed, Jewel's villainous qualities are especially highlighted in his abuse of Marianne. Before Jewel and Marianne are married, while Marianne is still a captive of the tribe, she attempts to flee, but Jewel catches her and rapes her. Carter makes it clear this assault is about dominance and subjugating Marianne, who is herself also aware of the intent behind the assault. As Carter writes of Marianne's response to Jewel, Marianne states, "You're nothing but a murderer," and she says this determined to maintain her superior status at all costs. Marianne later demands Jewel explain himself, at which point he replies, "There's the matter of our traditional hatred, and besides, I'm very frightened of you." Here, Carter emphasizes both the hatred and fear that arises out of not only the discrimination between the barbarians and professors as communities, but the hatred and fear that exists between these characters due to their power struggle as individuals. Shortly after this assault, Jewel and Marianne are married, an event which Carter uses to emphasize her subversion of the hero, as Donnelly's careful planning of the marriage celebration of course involves casting Jewel as a messiah and/or hero figure. As Carter describes Jewel during the wedding, after Marianne has taken in the grandiose outfit Donnelly constructed for Jewel, Marianne thinks he had become the sign of an idea of a hero, and she herself had been forced to impersonate the sign of a memory of a bride. But though she knew quite well she herself was only impersonating this sign, she could not tell whether Jewel was impersonating the other sign or had indeed become it, for every line of his outlandish figure expressed the most arrogant contempt, and it was impossible to tell whether or not this contempt was in his script. Here, Carter makes explicit commentary on her devaluing of the hero archetype, in that she insinuates that the hero is a figure of arrogance and contempt. Arrogance and contempt are indeed prominent character traits, not only found in Jewel, but in Marianne and Donnelly. Yet, as Carter implies, through Jewel, these three characters seem to employ such traits in service to hiding and/or staving off their fears, and at that in attempting to guarantee their superior positioning to the purpose of guaranteeing their own survival, be it a physical survival or a survival of their perceptions of themselves. In this cutthroat egocentrism, which surfaces despite affections and respect each character may hold for each other, the only form of saving with which these three are concerned is saving themselves. Even Jewel's ill-advised rescue attempt can be read as an act of self-preservation. With Donnelly exiled from the tribe, Jewel sinks into a severe depression due to his in part affectionate, in part manipulatively parasitical bond with Donnelly. Jewel resolves to save Donnelly to avert the existential crisis that the loss of Donnelly is causing him. Because of this, the one potentially heroic act of the novel, even though employed by one extremely flawed character to save another extremely flawed character, is undergone in self-service rather than in service to love or altruism. By the end of Heroes and Villains, Carter has therefore left the reader with no act of heroic saving or heroic sacrifice. There are no true heroes nor true villains. Simply flawed, complicated characters who are struggling to survive in a desperate and hostile setting. Despite their post-apocalyptic environment, the most desperate and hostile setting for these characters is indeed their own troubled human psyches. To conclude my presentation with another quote from our protagonist, Marianne states near the end of the novel, "When I was a little girl, we played at Heroes and Villains, but now I don't know which is which anymore, nor who is who." By radically subverting tropes that simplify communal and individual identities through mythopoeic archetypes, Carter explores how it is indeed possible to answer the question of which is which and who is who regarding human nature, but in a way that moves beyond the dichotomy of good and bad. Carter shows us that all we need to do to engage in such a dialogue is to stop playing at Heroes and Villains. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Caighlan. Thank you so much. Oh, let's get my mic. Hi, thank you. So next up is Arwa Al-Mubaddel. Hi, Arwa. And your presentation is The Radical Feminist Cultural Politics of Emotion in Angela Carter's The Passion of New Eve. And you spotlighted yourself?
No, how can I?
No?
How can I?
Spotlight for everyone, yeah.
Yes, okay.
All right, now you're spotlighted. Thank you so much, Arwa. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for organizing and participating in this conference, and I'm happy to be one of the speakers. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my mentor and spiritual mother, Professor Samia Al-Shayban, who passed away a couple of days ago. Professor Samia gave me the best compliment of my life by describing me as crazy as Angela Carter. So there's that. In my presentation today, I will be discussing the radical feminist cultural politics of emotion. I'll begin by first providing a synopsis of the work and then outlining the politics of emotions as discussed by Sarah Ahmed. Then I'll move into a discussion of how these emotions of anger, pain, and hope and wonder open up a metaphysical space for the main character of the novel. This is a work in progress, so I'll appreciate any comments. And so to begin, Carter's The Passion of New Eve is centered around Evelyn Evelyn/Eve, who starts the novel as a male misogynistic British academic who was displaced in a civil war-torn America. Militant feminist revolutionaries kidnap Eve, to use them as a prototype for a new feminist scientific experiment in which they are surgically transformed into a transgender woman. The goal of this experiment is to impregnate the new Eve with her own seed, thus making the existence of men as a biological and social category unnecessary. The radical feminists take Evelyn/Eve to the underground town of Beulah. Beulah is placed in the desert as an underground town, shaped architecturally as a womb. It is presided over by a deified human-turned fertility goddess called Mother, who is modeled after the fertility goddess Artemis. Beulah becomes the metaphorical birthing place for the now ultra-feminine Eve. And now Eve must also go through intense psychoprogramming to become a, quote, true, unquote, woman, feminine inside and out. Eve manages to escape the town, yet she's subjected to many sufferings for being a woman. At the end of the novel, Eve now has the option to be reverted to a male form. The mother goddess, now retired, is no longer part of Beulah, and she may help Eve achieve this goal. However, arriving at the womb-like caves by the sea, Eve experiences a transcendental, ahistorical, spiritual experience, embracing herself as a woman and deciding to sail off into the sea, into an open future. Utilizing Sarah Ahmed's discussion of feminist attachments and the cultural politics of emotions, I examine the cultural politics of radical feminist emotions. I discuss how Evelyn/Eve becomes an object of feminist anger, but also a subject of feminist wonder and hope. Eve experiences primal fear and pain in the feminist womb-like town of Beulah, yet these feelings prime her to move from the site of wounding into a new effective economy of feminist wonder and hope. And so I argue for the mediative role of Beulah in Eve's journey, as Eve reflects upon it as the place of her origin. My affective reading offers an appreciation of positive feminist emotions, which are often overlooked due to the satire of radical feminism in the novel. In examining the cultural politics of emotions, Sarah Ahmed outlines 4 emotions attached to feminism, and they are pain, anger, wonder, and hope. Ahmed inquires into how these feminist attachments relate to attachments already existing in the world, and she also probes into how they reproduce the power structures that feminism seeks to disrupt. She explains that, quote, it is the very assumption that feminism, quote, could, unquote, transcend the object of its critique that allows feminist attachments to be readable as a sign of failure, unquote. Pain, for instance, is crucial to feminist politics as women experience injustices and violence, with testimonies about women's pain being important to the formation of feminist collectives. Indeed, as Ahmed discusses, feminist therapy and consciousness-raising groups in the 1970s transformed the woman's pain into resistance and collectivity. The Passion of New Eve speaks directly to feminist pain and anger that eventually implodes as it inverts patriarchal oppression. This anger, however, is a feminist collective drive that serves to advance feminist agendas. However, it is taken too far by the feminists of Beulah as they exercise violence and replicate patriarchal oppression against Eve. The feminists of Beulah are motivated by their anger towards patriarchal institutions and by association men. As Eve/Evelyn witnesses, New York becomes infiltrated by the, quote, woman army, unquote, of Beulah. They are described as, quote, female sharpshooters, who took tools to sniping from concealed windows at men who lingered too long in front of posters outside blue movie theaters, unquote. Additionally, the woman, quote, blew up wedding shops and scoured newspapers for marriage announcements so that they could send bride gifts of well-honed razors, unquote. So clearly the women opposed patriarchal institutions and opposed the objectification of women, but they imposed the same kind of oppression upon Eve and expecting her to be a mother and to also be constructed in the form of an ultra-feminine woman, which can be seen, which Eve describes as the centerfold of a Playboy magazine. And thus, Evelyn Eve becomes an object of anger for the feminists and retribution for male oppression against women, and also for Evelyn's own misogyny. The matriarch of Beulah, the mother goddess, informs Evelyn/Eve of all the injustices that men subjected women to across different cultures through ceremonial rituals. As Eve recollects in this passage, she told me how the ancient Chinese had crippled their women's feet. The Jews had chained the ankles of their women together, and the Indians ordered widows to immolate themselves on the pyres of their husbands, and so on and so forth, unquote. By having the punishment of castration and biological experimentation inflicted on Evelyn/Eve's body, Eve becomes the site for a battle between the sexes. This is also an allusion by Angela Carter and a reference to, and actually a direct appropriation of one of the most famous radical feminists at the time. This speaks to Mary Daly's famous outlines of Sado-Ritual Syndrome and Gin Ecology, the Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, which was published in the 70s. And it also, this passage also echoes the feminist anger and Valerie Solanas' Come Manifesto, which was published in 1967. So I will not get into the analysis of these works, but this is just to show that Carter was speaking against these kind of attitudes in terms of feminist anger taken to the extreme. Now, while extreme feminist anger is critiqued in the novel, what is often overlooked is the feminist hope and wonder present in it. So the Passion of New Eve does engage with feminist hope and wonder, and this offers an effective opening for new ways of being in the world. As Ahmed explains, feminist anger is a form of, quote, againstness, unquote, while feminist hope and wonder reflect, quote, forness, unquote. And so it provides an affirmative, this forness provides an affirmative stance in relating to the world. And this forness also occurs through embodied experiences as a form of effective embodiment. As Ahmed explains, quote, the body opens as the world opens up before it. The body unfolds into the unfolding of a world that becomes approached as another body, unquote. And this can be applied to the case of Eve, who starts the novel in a male and male form, bodily form, and then at the end of the novel, she accepts her form, her female form, and there is some risk to this opening of wonder. And Sarah Ahmed explains that, quote, it is a passion that motivates the desire to keep looking. It keeps alive the possibility of freshness and vitality of a living that can live as if for the first time, unquote. So there is a newness to this experience and a passion that drives Eve forward to keep looking. And now, although Beulah is the place where Eve becomes an object of feminist anger, it's also the place of her origin. Eve repeatedly declares, quote, there is a place where contrarieties are equally true. This place is called Beulah, unquote. Even at the point of escaping Beulah, Eve has mixed feelings, as she expresses in the following passage. I did not know the apotheosis was inevitable, and however fast I fled, I could not run away from it, but would always be running towards it. Indeed, to run away from it would be the quickest way of arriving there. My inexorable destination selects my route. In this passage, Eve expresses contrary feelings and ambivalent emotions towards Beulah. She yearns to return to it while also desiring to escape. However, Eve's full transformation will not occur at the artificial womb-like setting of Beulah. It occurs much later, towards the end of the novel, at the womb-like caves near the sea in Southern California. The ending of New Eve is open, and it pushes Eve into a new journey of a different nature, a metaphysical journey that transcends suffering and worldly concerns, thus suggesting a new terrain of signification and emancipation. And so Eve is pushed into a metaphysical dimension where she experiences a sublimated and transcendent experience. The sea shoreline near the caves where Eve meets the now retired mother goddess is a reversal of her experience in Beulah. When Eve sails off to the ocean, this indicates an alternative feminist metaphysics, and this is also represented through the magical realist description of the caves. And although Mother is now a frail old woman who has abdicated her mythological power and suffered a nervous breakdown after her grand project failed due to Eve's escape, we find that the mother myth is reconstructed again, but this time through the earth and its cavernous spaces. The caves of Mother Earth are the wombs where Eve is reborn spiritually, as she transcends time and space through the cave's anteriority. Eve pushes through these spaces as if she was pushing herself back through a birth canal, quote, edging her way forward, flat as a flounder, crabwise along the crevice, unquote. Every movement necessitating, quote, the most extreme exertion, unquote, leaving Eve drenched in sweat. And the following excerpt, Eve dissociates momentarily and refers to herself in the third person. In this passage, in this excerpt, Eve describes the following. Eve negotiates with the concrete regression of this cave. Eve returns to Mother, unquote. Eve then drops into a wide, shallow pool of, quote, pleasantly warm water, unquote, and then wades through it to take great gulps of fresh air. This indicates the amphibian-like state Eve assumes, which also suggests a fluid subjectivity, and it also hints at her symbolic rebirth into this experience. Eve then emerges in a smaller cave filled by water at blood heat and emitting faint steam with a familiar dim red light for which she cannot discern a source. In this, the caves become a womb, but a natural womb, unlike the artificial ones in Beulah. And in these caves, Eve also finds a glass flank of, quote, a strange swan-necked shape flask, unquote. And in this flask, there is a large chunk of amber with the feather of a bird trapped in it. Rubbing the flask in her hands, the amber begins to slowly soften and it begins to liquefy, which indicates elemental collapse. And this elemental collapse is also connected to the notions of duration and progression. And so this is also connected to a mystical process where time becomes meaningless and Eve has no sensation of the passage of time, feeling, quote, the sick sudden sensation of falling that means one's heart has missed a beat, unquote. So this describes anachronistic time, and so this is where time is no longer relevant. Here, Eve describes time as running back on itself, and it is here that Eve and the ember undergo a process of reversal. And so the amber refreshes and the waters rise and gurgle energetically, and this signifies a resurge of life. Time now passes, and Eve is drawn by the walls of the cave, and they are turned into walls of flesh. And there's pulsations and rhythmic movements that ingest Eve, and this mimics vaginal contractions. And unlike the goddess mother of Beulah's violation of Evelyn, Eve is not afraid of this experience, and she does not experience fear and terror. In this context, she intuits that, quote, mother is a figure of speech and has retired to a cave beyond consciousness, unquote. So the notion of mother as a person is no longer relevant to Eve, and here mother becomes a natural energy. And here Eve falls into the antithetical darkness of the last cave, in which darkness becomes animated, and it wounds up the spool of time. So Eve sees herself as a primate before evolution, and she sees the beginning of time and the beginning of the beginning, even before history itself. And here Eve looks at the sea and, quote, the sound of the sea becomes omnipresent, the sea which washes away all memory and retains it, unquote. And so here, the sea represents rebirth, mystery, and a feminine subjectivity, and it becomes the culmination of this maternal metaphysical experience. This becomes evident in the following passage, where Eve declares, I have come home. The destination of all journeys is their beginning. I have not come home. I emitted at last a single inconsolable cry like that of a newborn child. Mama, mama, mama. She never answered. Here, Eve's metaphysical experience oscillates between two contradictory states, and she simultaneously experiences a sense of belonging and unbelonging. She is at the interiority of time and is both child and mother. Her cries are not answered because this initiation process is to thrust Eve into her own mythological motherhood and signals her tribute to evolution as she is one of her kind. The reverse birth serves the purpose of making Eve an originary mother herself, as her name indicates. It is at this moment that the caves open up to the sea, suggesting the start of Eve's own mythology. The myth of Aphrodite is evoked at the end of this journey, and Eve is given the choice to be reverted to male anatomical form. However, Eve does not want to return to her former self and former body. Like the Titan Uranus, who threw his father's male organs into the sea, Eve tosses her dismembered phallus into the ocean. Out of this act, her rebirth is made complete as she sails off into the vast sea. Thus, the conclusion to the Passion of New Eve is not an end to the narrative, but rather signals another journey with a utopian horizon, with what Eve describes as a start from the conclusion. The last sentence of the novel, to conclude, the last sentence of the novel is Eve's supplication to the ocean. Quote, ocean, ocean, mother of mysteries, bear me to the place of birth, unquote. This place of birth is the place of birth of Eve's own expansive, fluid subjectivity. It also offers a horizon of hope for Eve to give birth to a child she conceived out of love, and hence Eve becomes a regenerative mother. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arwa. That was really interesting. The next and final one in this panel is Nadia. Nadia, are you able to put your camera on and unmute? Oh, hi. Hi, Nadia.
Hello.
And your paper is When Love and Death Embrace Angela Carter's Asexual Erotics. please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Please excuse my voice. It is 5:44 a.m. in Massachusetts. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yes, okay, I can see it in the camera. All right. So let's get started. Originally published in the United Kingdom in 1979, Angela Carter's anthology of short stories, The Bloody Chamber, extracts the latent material from folk and fairy tales and represents them as feminist stories of love, death, and eroticism. Under the veneer of fairy wings, these short stories reveal the workings of an asexual erotics, an erotics not based in sexual love or sexuality, but in care. This paper examines a story from the anthology, The Lady of the House of Love. A loose retelling of Sleeping Beauty, the story features a pair of characters bound by an asexual erotics, leading to the rescue of one by the other. Using the seminal essay by Audre Lorde, Uses of the Erotic is Power, and the work of Ella Prigiblo on asexual erotics, this paper argues that the plot of The Lady of the House of Love is fueled by, and cannot reach completion without, asexual erotics. This allows the characters to engage in an erotic that is relational and decoupled from sex, but still intimate and indicative of care. The Asexual Visibility and Education Network, AVEN, describes an asexual person as, quote, a person who does not experience sexual attraction, end quote. This is a definition that lacks nuance, as asexuality offers us a lens through which to view relating, intimacy, and sociality without solely focusing on sexual attraction. In her book, Asexual Erotics, Ella Prigiblo states that definitions that spring from the asexual community suggest that, quote, sexual attraction is not an innate aspect of intimate or interpersonal life, thus challenging compulsory sexuality or the belief that sex and sexuality are core components of being human, end quote. These include labels such as asexual, demisexual, and graysexual that allow for a spectrum of understanding to develop in terms of sexual desire. So how then does an asexual person engage in the erotic? Eros was understood by Plato to be, quote, one form of love among many, including friendship love and familial love, end quote. It wasn't until Sigmund Freud's work on Eros that the erotic became, quote, bound strongly to sexual passion through the assertion that the sexual drive and libido are at the base of all human action and relationships, at the base of all erotics, end quote. This essay is based upon Audre Lorde's conception of the erotic, rather than Freudian or Platonic. Lorde's 1978 essay, Uses of the Erotic is Power, defines the erotic as, quote, a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. While Lorde designates this deepest and non-rational knowledge as being centered in a binary model of gender, it can also be understood as the depth of feeling that all humans are capable of engaging with. According to Lorde, the erotic functions in several ways, including, quote, providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. This power, end quote, this power can be used for anything from discussing an idea together to revolution. That sharing, no matter what form it takes, quote, forms a bridge between the sharers which can be the basis of understanding much of what is not shared between them, end quote. The erotic allows us to see each other and engage in the sharing of feelings. It fuels our relationships with others and with ourselves. As Prigiblo states, quote, research on asexuality has tended to prioritize asexual people as atomistic units instead of thinking about them in context of relating, end quote. By using a Lordean conception of the erotic, which avoids tying emotional depth and intimacy to sex, we can de-emphasize sex as the most deep and meaningful erotic activity one can engage in. This essay utilizes what Prigiblo calls asexual resonances, an undertaking, quote, involving an asexual reading of text that may not be obviously asexual or identifiable as asexual in terms of orientatory definitions, end quote. It's likely that Angela Carter did not intentionally write asexual erotics into her fairy tale retellings, and yet those resonances exist. The Lady of the House of Love begins with describing the, quote, beautiful somnambulist, end quote, the last bud of the poison tree that sprang from the loins of Vlad the Impaler. It begins with, Wearing an antique bridal gown, the beautiful queen of the vampires sits all alone in her dark high house under the eyes of the portraits of her demented and atrocious ancestors, each one of whom, through her, projects a baleful posthumous existence. She counts out the tarot cards, ceaselessly construing a constellation of possibilities, as if the random fall of the cards on the plush red tablecloth before her could precipitate her from her chill, shuttered room into a country of perpetual summer and obliterate the sadness of a girl who is both death and the maiden. She is beautiful, but her, quote, beauty is a symptom of her disorder, of her soullessness, end quote. In her ancient ancestral mansion, the Countess Nosferatu lives among, quote, depredations of rot and fungus everywhere, but the mistress of this disintegration notices nothing, end quote. She cannot be consoled for the ghastliness of her condition. She resorts to the magic comfort of the tarot pack, constantly constructing hypotheses about a future which is irreversible, end quote. The Countess lays out her cards, which are always the same. Quote, always she turns up la papesse, la mort, la tour abolie, wisdom, death, dissolution, end quote. She is, quote, a cave full of echoes, a system of repetitions, a closed circuit, end quote. Everything about this, quote, beautiful and ghastly lady is as it should be, queen of night, queen of terror, except for her horrible reluctance for the role, end quote. The Countess dreams of being human, although she does not know if it's possible. She, quote, loathes the food she eats. She would have liked to take the rabbits home with her, feed them on lettuce, pet them, but hunger always overcomes her, end quote. She will never be able to resist biting into the rabbit's neck, nor will she stifle the, quote, small cry of both pain and disgust, end quote. But now, quote, she is a woman, she must have men, end quote. She is doomed to repeat the circuit of entertaining any young man foolish enough to wander near her dilapidated mansion, seducing him and eating him. Although not explicitly stated, the Countess can be read as a virgin. She uses the promise of sex as a lure for her victims, but she never actually goes through with it. Then enters the unnamed soldier, a, quote, young officer in the British Army, blonde, blue-eyed, heavily muscled, end quote, with the, quote, special quality of virginity, end quote. This power in potentia will protect him as this, quote, being rooted in change and time collides with the timeless Gothic eternity of the vampires, for whom all is as it always has been and will always be, end quote. He is a live wire about to fall in the Countess's closed circuit. The officer is a virgin and yet different than the Countess in his virginity. The Countess is trying and failing to perform heteronormative sexuality in the only way she knows. The officer, on the other hand, turned down his commanding officer's invitation to a brothel. His celibacy is his own choice, in direct opposition with the Countess, who would, quote, like to caress their lean brown cheeks and stroke their ragged hair, but falls victim to her hunger every time. She mourns for her victims and for what she has failed to do. Quote, the blood on the Countess's cheeks will be mixed with tears, end quote. The officer drinks from the fountain in the village square and is invited to the mansion by the Countess's mute keeper. As they leave the village, the officer receives his first warning of the Countess. Quote, a great intoxicated surge of the heavy scent of red roses blew into his face, inducing a sensuous vertigo, a blast of rich, faintly corrupt sweetness strong enough almost to fell him. Too many roses. Too many roses bloomed on the enormous thickets that lined the path, thickets bristling with thorns, and the flowers themselves were almost too luxuriant, their huge congregations of plush petals somehow obscene in their excess, their whorled, tightly budded cores outrageous in their implications. End quote. The Countess's roses are fed with the bodies of her doomed lover meals. The prophetic scent of the corrupt roses would be enough, but Carter takes it a step farther by describing the size and shape of the roses in the manner that she does. Whorled, tightly budded cores and huge congregations of plush petals bring up imagery of female genitalia. When combining the man fertilizer and the image of the Countess's vulva, Carter explicitly links sex and death. Those men who hunger for the Countess and allow themselves to be led to her boudoir inevitably end up feeding the roses that lure in the next victim. This would seem to be a statement on the fairy tale and horror movie trope that if one has sex, death is right around the corner. Sex is the Countess's only mode of connecting with the outside world. With the exception of her mute keeper and her food, she has no contact with anyone, and reflects that she's often so silent that she thinks, quote, she too will soon forget how to do so and nobody here will ever talk again, end quote. But tonight is a different night. Tonight, the, quote, waxen fingers of the Countess, fingers of a holy image, turn of the card called Le Amoureux, end quote. Never before have the tarot cards changed. Never before has she cast herself a fate involving love. The Countess trembles. Quote, the lovely cartomancer has, this time, the first time, dealt herself a hand of love and death, end quote. The officer, having eaten a solitary dinner in the worm-eaten hall, is invited to the Countess's sitting room, enclosed in the, quote, unacknowledged pentacle of his virginity, end quote. As they sit together, the Countess reflects that, quote, however hard she tries to think of any other, she only knows of one kind of consummation, end quote. The Countess has had no family, no lovers, no friends with which to engage in any sort of asexual erotic relationship, because she only knows how to forge a relationship in blood. Quote, she has no mouth with which to kiss, no hands with which to caress, only the fangs and talons of a beast of prey, end quote. The Countess aches desperately for a friend and for a lover. She knows nothing other than the lure of sex and the trap of death. A simple sentence enters the narration. You will be my prey, end quote. And yet the Countess thinks, quote, when you came through the door retaining about you all the golden light of a summer's day, of which I know nothing, the card called Le Amoureux emerged. It seemed to me you had stepped off the card into my darkness, and for a moment I thought perhaps you might irradiate it, end quote. The Countess allows herself a brief moment of hope that she will be able to break her circuit, as the lover's card had broken her inevitable tarot. And in the same moment, quote, the beastly forebears on her walls condemn her to a perpetual repetition of their passions, end quote. The narration continues. I do not mean to hurt you. I shall wait for you in my bride's dress in the dark. The bridegroom is come. He will go into the chamber which has been prepared for him. I am condemned to solitude and dark. I do not mean to hurt you. I will be very gentle. And could love free me from the shadows? Can a bird sing only the song it knows, or can it learn a new song? It will all be over quickly, end quote. But, as Carter reminds us, quote, one kiss, however, and only one, woke up the sleeping beauty of the wood. The officer, protected by his virginity, is, quote, immune to shadow, since he does not know yet what there is to be afraid of, and due to his heroism makes him like the sun, end quote. Carter notes that his, quote, lack of imagination gives his heroism to the hero, end quote, and thus he cannot think of her as anything but, quote, so delicate and damned, poor thing, quite damned, end quote. Her eyes break his heart with their, quote, waif-like lost look, end quote, and yet he is, quote, disturbed, almost repelled by her extraordinarily fleshy mouth. It is a mouth of, quote, wide, full, prominent lips of a vibrant purplish crimson, a morbid mouth, a whore's mouth, end quote. This is a direct callback to the description of the roses, further linking the Countess to sex and death. Despite all this, the soldier thinks the Countess is ill and wants to, quote, take her into his arms and protect her from the ancestors who leer down from the walls, end quote. The officer demonstrates an erotics of care here in his desire to take her away from her ancient decayed home and, quote, to Zurich, to a clinic, she will be treated for nervous hysteria, then to an eye specialist for her photophobia, and to a dentist to put her teeth into better shape. We shall turn her into the lovely girl she is. I shall cure her of these nightmares, end quote. His desires are not to bed her, as all the men before him have hoped, but to fix what he sees as damaged and damned. While this has implications of misogyny and sexism, the officer is offering care to what he sees as another human, not a vampire. But it will end in blood, no matter his goodness. The Countess cuts her finger and for the first time sees her own blood. The officer wraps it in a handkerchief, and when that doesn't stop the bleeding, quote, puts his mouth to the wound. He will kiss it better for her, as her mother, had she lived, would have done, end quote. And in that moment, in his asexual erotics of care, he is an exorcism of her demons. Carter states that the Countess has, quote, waited for him all her life without knowing it, end quote. She has waited for someone to bring her an asexual relationship, to bring her out of her exile in this dank, decrepit mansion. The Countess dies in the night, finally human and finally free from her repetitive existence. In death, the Countess looks, quote, far older, less beautiful, and so, for the first time, fully human, end quote. She has delved into the spiritual plane that is home to the erotic and finally become human. Just before the unnamed soldier leaves, the narration gives us these lines, quote, "I was only an invention of the darkness, and I shall leave for you as a souvenir the dark, fanged rose I plucked from between my thighs like a flower laid on a grave," end quote. This is the closing of the circuit of the roses. Despite not sleeping with the Countess and not succumbing to her rose vulva or vulva mouth, he has ingested her blood and is now irrevocably different. He takes the rose with him when he leaves and puts it in a glass of water. The soldier returns to his quarters and finds them, quote, "brimmed with the reeling odor of a glowing velvet monstrous flower, whose petals had regained all their former bloom and elasticity, their corrupt, brilliant, baleful splendor," end quote. How will the pentagram of his virginity protect him when he has drunk the blood of the last scion of the Nosferatu? The Lady of the House of Love gestures first to sexuality as violence. The Countess's sexuality is linked to death and violence in her closed circuit. Each victim is seduced, a, quote, "bridegroom to bleed on her inverted marriage bed," end quote. Her desires for a love without blood are overwhelmed by her desires to feed, to eat, to live. She can only be violent because that is all she's been taught, a reflection of the violent sexuality we see in our own reality. Prigiglo touches briefly on that violent sexuality at the end of Asexual Erotics in her discussion of involuntary celibates, people who plan to take down a, quote, "system in which women can deny sex to men and in which some men receive more access to sex with women than others," end quote. Asexuality has nothing to do with that tyrannical celibacy, and voluntary celibacy need not be seen as the cure-all for sexuality as violence, nor its opposite. The resonances of asexual erotics are slightly deeper. The Countess's fangs, sharpened on years and years of young men's bones, are dulled because of the care a young officer was willing to show her. This demonstrates Carter's de-emphasizing of sex as the pinnacle of erotic activity. The officer is not even interested in having sex with her, seeing her only as a sick young girl who needs his help and care. Instead, their intimacy is that of that moment of, quote, "innocent remedies of the nursery," end quote. He wants only to stop the bleeding, and in doing so, his innocence and courage break the vampire's curse. His voluntary celibacy clashes with the Countess's compulsory sexuality and requires us to rethink our compulsory sexuality, our notion that sex and sexual desire are, quote, "natural, innate, and consistent for all people, especially for white, heterosexual, able-bodied, and coupled individuals," end quote. Our blonde, blue-eyed English hero would fit neatly into that category, and yet he steps away from compulsory sexuality to engage in an asexual erotic and an erotic of care. Asexual erotics are desperately important, even outside the world of vampires and brave young men. We cannot be dependent on connection only from those who we are romantically or sexually involved with, or miss out on the depth of human connection available to us. This depth can often be our saving grace. Where would we, desperately lonely as a people, be without care and feeling from someone else, without a helping hand? Thank you.
There was a long applause, but I was mostly on mute. I'm sorry. There was a good applause here. Thank you, Nadia. So now it's our first hybrid question time. So we'll find out how that goes. I think Naomi, you might be more experienced than me. So we've got. There's an icon with a smiley face and a hand for the people that are online. So if you want to put your hand up, I think that would be useful. And if anybody here wants to put their hand up, I think we'll do it that way.
And maybe if Natsumi is still here, we can take questions for her as well. I know it's quite late for her in Japan, but hopefully she might be. Yes, she's here.
Does anybody have their hand up? No, it's helpful.
Yeah. You can spotlight everyone, yeah.
But that doesn't say remove spotlight.
So Nadia's still spotlit. We only seem to spotlight one person at a time.
That's okay. Okay, so it looks like maybe no questions at the moment. I think.
Are there questions?
I think that a lot of the questions were sorted out in the chat with Natsumi earlier. I
had a question actually for Arwa. Yes. Oh, I was really interested in your discussion, and the idea of Beulah. It's been a while since I read the novel, and since then I've become more interested in Blake. And it really felt to me like Evil and Eve's journey is a Blakean journey. Beulah being Blake's place of the subconscious, and yet not a place where we're supposed to, not a destination we're supposed to arrive at. We need to go on and to fourfold vision, and the sense of moving from the Newton's, God save us from Newton's single vision, the rationality of the Englishman. And I just wondered if you might reflect on that, or if that was something that you've been encountering in your readings on the novel.
So this paper is actually part of a larger section I'm writing on affect in Angela Carter's Passion of New Eve. And in another section, I discuss the Blakean influence in terms of contraries, and also the symbolism that Evelyn represents in the beginning, being described as a little English lamb and having this kind of idyllic connotations that actually tie into Blake's songs of innocence and experience. So I do see a large Blakean influence, and I discuss the idea of contraries in another section. And I'm sure, as you know, Carter admired Blake, and she referenced him a lot in his work, so it's definitely there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful connection to the British counterculture that she was so immersed in, and then herself obviously infused as well. Thank you. That's fascinating. It'd be really interesting to read that whole work, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the suggestions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sarah, can you unmute yourself? Yes, Sarah Gamble.
Yes, unmuted. I've got a question for Nadia, because I was really interested in your paper, Nadia, about when you read The Lady of the House of Love through the notion of asexuality, because it's such a different take on how Carter is usually read, and particularly The Bloody Chamber, of course, is read very much as a highly sexualized work. You concentrated on one story, but how do you see that notion of asexuality and relationships founded on the notion of care running through the collection as a whole?
The other obvious example of it in that collection is The Bloody Chamber itself, that first story, because while there is that sort of sense of the erotic with the blind piano tuner, the rescue is really perpetrated by her mother. And it's that erotics of care and that erotic of mother-daughter intuition that leads to the rescue in that story, in the same way that the rescue of The Lady of the House of Love is an asexual erotics from person to person, as opposed to mother to daughter.
But do you see it running through the collection as a whole, or just surfacing in particular stories?
Well, you wouldn't see it in the Earl King, but perhaps in Tiger Bride? Because you could say perhaps that there's not really a romantic love as much as there is sort of that depth of understanding of wildness and animalisticness between the beast and the narrator.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nadia.
Yes, thank you. That was a really fascinating lens to bring to Carter, as you say. It's that idea, I think, of the old wine in new bottles. Okay, yeah, a question here. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we'll get here.
We're getting the hang of it. Okay.
Sorry. Hi, Nadia. I was wondering if you, this is for you, and I don't know how to pronounce your name, Kaylee? There we go. I wonder if you two can sort of not merge what you were both talking about, but sort of see the link of each other in the other, if you see what I mean. I feel like while I was listening, my brain was doing sort of jumping between heroes and villains and the Lady of the House of Love, and between what you were talking about, the Nadia, the asexual erotics, and sort of the ideas the character has about, you know, non-heroes and non-villains. Basically, I just wanted to hear a discussion between the two of you, if that's okay. Thank you.
So that's for Nadia and Caighlan.
Nadia,
Okay, I am unmuted.
Do you want to go first, or should I? Or I'm good either way.
I'm not familiar with heroes and villains as much, but I do see sort of the gray area of, you know, the Lady of the House of Love is not necessarily, the Countess Nosferatu is not necessarily the villain, although he is sort of, the soldier is sort of painted as the hero. But I think there's definitely blurred lines for Countess Nosferatu, because in some ways she's the villain and the victim.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent point, and it definitely, I have read The Lady of the House of Love, but it was years ago, so I'm not as fresh on that as heroes and villains. But yeah, the way that she just consistently troubles all these different tropes we have with the whole good evil idea, and especially these fairy tales that are so historically used to push what any idea of good or bad or hero or villain might be societally for the time. But on another level, just listening to both the presentations were fascinating. Thank you, guys. But your theories around the erotics and Angela Carter's use of the erotics, that of course comes into heroes and villains a lot as well. I didn't have time to dive into it, but there are several moments where you can pull out the different use of different types of erotics, different types of intimacy, to expand in a bunch of different directions. So your presentation really got me thinking in light of just a bunch of different Carter analysis. So thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. I think that might be the end of the questions. So we're going to come back at 11:35. We're going to have a tea break. I would encourage you to have a screen break if you can, but I know that you might want to stay on and chat while you have the opportunity. Nadia, do you want to say anything else? Or? All right, I'm going to stop recording and we'll come back at 11:35.